Welcome back to Greek and Roman Mythology, Beach House Edition. In my last lecture, we talked about some of the changes that took place in the Roman Empire that led to the rise of a man like Augustus. And in this lecture, I want to talk about one of the last major things that Augustus did that would truly change the landscape of the Roman culture. And that was this. In the year 29, he commissioned the author Virgil to write the Roman national epic for the Roman Empire. Now, up to this point, of course, the Greeks had had the Iliad and the Odyssey to tell them what it was to be a good Greek. But the Romans didn't have a national work of art that told them what it meant to be Roman. And I think you'll see that when we talk about the kind of themes that come up in this work, that it is distinctly Roman. So let's dive right in and talk a bit about its composition and its author. Its author was a man named Publius Vergilius Maro, to us just Virgil. You can see that he was born in 70 BCE and died in 19 BCE, so he didn't live that long of a life. He came up in a circle of poets called the Neoterics, who prided themselves on writing quick, witty, elusive poems that were very short, and he never saw himself as much of an author of epic. However, in 29 BCE, he got tapped to write the Roman national epic by Augustus, and what Augustus wants, he gets. He worked on it for 10 years, writing only 6 lines a day. You see, Virgil was hung up on perfection. The thing he liked about writing short poems was you could have quality control, and that was tougher in an epic. So he treated the composition of his national epic as if it were the composition of many really short poems, all strung together. On his deathbed, he wasn't quite satisfied that it was finished, so he declared that it ought to be burned, but at the behest of Augustus, his executors finished it for him and saved it from the flames. So let's talk about the kind of things that come up in this poem. We're going to look for themes, and we'll talk about how it was written. In this part of the lecture, I call Aeneid Book 1, Pietas. It's the new black. Here's what the opening lines of the Aeneid sound like in their original Latin. Bear in mind, this is written in the same dactylic hexameter meter that Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey were written in. Only it's written in a new language. It's written in Latin. And here's what this sounds like. Arma virumque cano, Troia qui prima sabores Italiam fato profugus, laviniaque venit, litora multe leteris, jactatus et alto, vi superum saevae memorum unionis aviram, multa quo bello passus dum condere turbum, infereque Deos latio, genus unde latinum, albanique patres, atque altae moenia Romae. As you can see, this has the same kind of sing-song meter as Homer's work. It's a bit more hard and percussive sounding and not quite as vowely, but it's the same idea. Now let's look to the opening lines of this poem and that of the Iliad for some hints as to themes in these works as they pop up. In the Aeneid, we find that arms and a man and Juno's relentless wrath come up, as do war and Rome and people being offended and devotion. And if we look over at the Iliad, we see this isn't too different. There's rage, and there's a clash between Agamemnon and godlike Achilles. But wait a minute. What's the name of the hero in this poem? I'll circle back to that in a minute. People are offended in both poems, but who gets offended in the opening lines of the Aeneid? It's not any human who gets offended, and it's not any human who has rage. It's in fact a goddess, and her name is Juno. And her rage, not that of a mortal, will be driving a lot of the action of this poem as we go along. So let's talk about the composition of this. Both Homer and Virgil composed using dactylic hexameter. Homer's poetry is composed orally, but Virgil wrote his out. That is to say, he sat down at a desk and thought about what he was going to write and planned it extremely carefully. Virgil's Aeneid begins in medias res, just like the Odyssey. That is to say, we start in the middle of the story and kind of work our way out to the edges to find out what happens. Virgil designed his Aeneid to be like the Iliad and the Odyssey rolled into one. And this is interesting. The first 6 books of the Aeneid are very much like the Odyssey, and the last 6 books are very much like the Iliad. So they're the Odyssean books and the Iliadic books, according to scholars. Let's turn again to our themes. Both books invoke the muse for inspiration and speak of rage. Again, while in Homer, humans are the ones possessing the rage, here it's a goddess. What's the name of our hero again? We don't get the name of our hero in the Aeneid. not until well into the poem. The poem is called the Aeneid because its hero is a man named Aeneas. You don't get his name in the opening lines. How do we know what he's like? I mean, if we look to the left and we look at the Iliad, we can see that there's a clash between Agamemnon, we can find out he's a warlord, and Achilles, who is godlike. Well, what's the hero who's in this like? Well, we can tell that there's one thing about him that's really important. He's a man of faultless devotion. He's a man of faultless devotion. And that brings us to the first set of Latin words raised by the first book of this poem. And the first one is pietas. And that's a noun meaning one's sense of duty to one's gods, family, and country. And our man Aeneas is chock full of pietas, right? He's always thinking about what it is he needs to do or has to do in order to honor his gods, his family, and his country. And for this reason, he's described as pious, right? Pious. He's not rageful or warlike in the same way that the other heroes we met so far. If Agamemnon is a warlord, and Achilles is godlike, and Odysseus is polytropos, Aeneas is for sure pious. Pious. Now let's talk about what Virgil's doing when he's writing this poem. In Virgil's Aeneid, he references other poems very self-consciously. And for all we know, the Iliad is also referencing earlier poems that we don't know of. But with Virgil, we have those poems written out elsewhere, and we can compare them. There's a phenomenon that exists in Virgil's Aeneid called intertextuality, and that's when one work of literature refers to another work of literature. And the effect for us, the reader, if we've read both works, is that the way Virgil references the Iliad brings our understanding of the Iliad into our reading of the Aeneid, and it affects it. So even as we think of Achilles when we see a hero like Turnus later in this poem, it affects how we read this. The earliest example of this happening in this poem that I can think of is a reference to Odysseus from the Odyssey. And here's what happens. At the very beginning of the poem, when we finally do meet Aeneas, he's praying for death as Juno's trying to zap his ships with a storm. He says 3 times, 4 times luckier were those who died under their parents' eyes under Troy's high walls. And I want you to think about Book 5 of the Odyssey, where Odysseus says almost exactly the same thing as he's being tossed about on the raft as he leaves Calypso's island, but has been discovered by Poseidon and is now being zapped by a storm. So, the author wants us to think of Odysseus. The author wants us to think of the Odyssey. What is this phenomenon? Is it just pale imitation? I don't think so. Virgil wants to conjure in our minds images of these older things to inform the way we read his, but there's going to be a tension between the way those things happen in the books of Homer and the way they happen in the Aeneid. That is, Aeneas isn't like Odysseus in some ways, and even though he can be compared to him, there's always a contrast. Virgil wants you to see the contrast in the way the two things happen in an individual poem. While Odysseus is fated to make it to shore only by himself, remember, he's worried about getting back home, Aeneas will make it to shore with 7 of his ships. He's got responsibilities, he's got family, he's got a crew. So even as he wishes for death in the beginning, he gets it together, and he ends up saving a lot of people, because he's a different kind of hero. And Virgil wants you to understand that. He's a man distinguished for his pietas. Well, of course, Aeneas will make it to shore, and he'll discover that he's come to the land of Carthage, and that's in North Africa, far, far from where he's headed in Italy, the land of Hesperia. He'll make his way into town, and that's when he'll come under the protection of Queen Dido, the Queen of Carthage. And it's in Book 2 that Dido begs Aeneas, because she has a crush on him, to explain his story to her. And very much like in the Hall of Lord Alcinous in Scheria in the Odyssey, Aeneas will tell us his story, and we'll find out how things have gone for him since he left Troy. Book 2 is mostly, however, concerned with the fall of Troy. So, without further ado, let's talk about Book 2, the fall of Troy, and what it has to say about the Romans' attitude towards the Greeks. So a lot of this book is concerned with the trick of the Trojan horse, and how the Greeks were able to get this thing into the city of Troy. And they do it by a trick. the Greeks send out a man named Sinon onto the beach. And he explains that he's been left behind by the Greeks as part of a sacrifice that has gone wrong. And the Trojan horse is really an offering to the gods, and the Greeks believe that by leaving it there, they have favorable winds to sail home. The Trojans buy it. Why do they buy it? Not because what Sinon is saying is believable, but because he's really good at talking. And this gets to a Roman idea about the Greeks, that is, that they're really good at talking and persuading others to do things, even if what they're persuading them to do is not good. Of course, it's a trick. We know how this ends. The Trojan horse is full of Greek soldiers who burn the city of Troy to the ground. But the Trojans didn't know it at the time. They're kind of an earnest lot. It's at this point that the character of Laocoon is introduced, and he's a priest who believes that it's a trick and that they shouldn't trust it. They shouldn't take it into the city. Because the gods favor the Greeks in this instance, Athena, aka Minerva, sends 2 sea serpents out of the water to eat Laocoon and his 2 children. And the Trojans believe this has to do with him not being pious, so they take it as an omen that they need to bring the horse inside the city. We know how this goes. Now, we get a lot from Aeneas in this book. We find out a little bit more about his character. What kind of guy is he? Well, we've seen that he can be whiny. When we first meet him, he's begging for death. Is he stupid? There's a scene where he meets his mother in book 1, and he seems to mistake her for someone else. He's fooled by her trick at first. Is he tough? Aeneas fights a lot during the fall of Troy. And in fact, at one point, his own mother, Venus, has to intervene and keep him from killing Helen. Right? When he comes home from fighting, he decides to go out and fight some more. However, some stuff's going to stop him. And perhaps it has to do with parental concern. I mean, he has witnessed Priam's death at the hands of Achilles' son Neoptolemus, and that was horrific for him. But also, he witnesses omens together with his father, saying that they don't need to fight, they need to leave. Right? And what do they see? His son Ulysses' head catches on fire but doesn't burn, and that omen is sealed by a falling star coming out of the sky and landing in the place where they need to take their ships and run. At the end of this book, we get pious Aeneas. Aeneas puts aside his weapons, puts a lion skin over his shoulder, puts his father, who's crippled, over his shoulder. His father carries the statues of their gods out of the city. He holds his toddler son by the hand and walks him out of the city, and behind comes his wife. Aeneas is concerned with everyone but himself. He decides to put away the whiny Aeneas, the tough guy Aeneas, and focus on his devotion to his gods, they're right here, his family, and not his country, but his new country. He'll have a leadership role, and he has to think about others, and he will do that then. So, he'll get in his ship, and he'll wander around the Mediterranean. And after many adventures, they will land here, at Carthage, which is where our story with Dido begins. Well, stay tuned for my next lecture on Book 4 and what that has to do with the Punic Wars and the state of Carthage.